Over the course of a year, all of us anglers use a lot of different lures. We use different lures for different seasons. But this year, I really tried to take a note and really tried to think about the certain lures that I use most over the course of the years. That ones that didn't just work in one season, but worked across many. And today, I want to share with you my top 5 lures for 2022. So let's dive right into it. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. Not only can you get all of your fishing tackle, rods, reels, lures, fishing line at Sportsman's Outfitters, but you can also pick up a lot of your hunting gear. And we are currently in the hunting season. So if you guys would like to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, you can click those links down below in the description and pick up some of your favorite gear. Now, the first lure on my list, the one that I caught a tremendous amount of bass in a number of different seasons, is the Strike King Hybrid Hunter. If you guys have not fished this bait, I am going to greatly encourage you to fish this exact bait. Now, this particular bait was designed by Todd Castledine. He's a professional bass fisherman. He lives down in Texas, and he really designed this bait to be able to come through grass extremely well. And this bait does just that. It will come through grass, even though it is a crankbait. It comes through grass really, really well. You can actually rip it out of grass almost in the same way that you would a chatterbait. And a chatterbait for a long time has been one of my favorite lures. But this year, I really started using that hybrid hunter in a lot of the same situations where I would use a chatterbait in the past. And not only did it work well in grass, but it worked really, really well around wood and rock cover. This really became a square bill replacement for me. Now, here in Ohio, we have a lot of smaller fish. So I fished the junior size of this bait a lot. I fished it all over the place. I mean, on the inland lakes, I fished it up on Lake Erie. I fished it all over the place, and it continued to catch bass no matter where I went, and in seasons and water temperatures that I didn't think it was gonna happen. For instance, I fished it in water temperatures early in the year that were like 48, 49, 50 degrees water temp. And that's pretty cold water, especially for a lure that has a wide wobble to it. And I absolutely crushed them on this particular lure. I mean, catching a ton of fish and just having a blast. Now, this lure, I fish on kind of my typical square bill gear. So that is a 7-foot medium rod that is a composite rod. I like the Arc Series grinder rod, and I will list all the equipment down below if you guys want to check this out. But this lure, you can fish it on anything from 12-pound tests up to 20-pound tests, really depending on the cover that you are fishing. It dives about 2 to 5 foot deep, again, depending on the pound test that you are using. And it's just a great lure. It's one that I'm really highly going to recommend that you just pick up and try in a lot of the same situations where you would throw a chatterbait, a spinnerbait, or a square bill. Now, the second lure is actually a soft plastic that I use on the back of a Texas rig. And as you guys know, a Texas rig pretty much dominates no matter where you go. It's one of my confidence baits. If I can't get bit, I'm going to pick up a Texas rig. Now, there were 2 specific soft plastics that I really couldn't figure out which one I liked more than the other because I caught so many bass on these 2 soft plastics. And the one was a Berkley Pit Boss, and the other one was a Missile Baits D-Bomb. These 2 plastics, I mean, they're nothing new, guys. These are just plastics that really dominated for me this year. I picked up those 2, the Pit Boss or the Missile Baits D-Bomb, pretty much anywhere I went. If I was fishing in heavy cover or reeds or around wood cover, if I was flipping or pitching, those are the soft plastics that I would use. Now, these 2 lures are a little bit different. They have a pretty much similar shape to them, but if you look at the Pit Boss, to me, it's kind of like a mix between a crawl and a beaver style bait because it doesn't have quite the action that a crawl does when you flip it or pitch it in the water. It doesn't have really big flapping flappers, but it does have flappers on the side that do kind of quiver a little bit as you fish it. So the thing that I like about that is that I could use this bait in really clear water or in really stained water and still get bit. Now, the Missile Baits D-Bomb is more of your beaver style bait. It doesn't have a ton of action to it, but there are so many times when we fish where not having a lot of action is going to get you a lot more bites. This particular lure I used a ton when I was flipping and pitching down in Florida, and I caught an absolute ton of bass while these bass were actually kind of moving up to spawn, including a pretty big 6-pounder, which I will show you right here.
Come here. Come here.
Now, I actually had 2 specific setups for this Texas rig, and one was kind of my general purpose pitching rod. I use this one a ton if I was pitching under docks or into laydowns, under overhanging trees. And that was a 7-foot 3-inch medium heavy fast action rod with 40-pound braided line to a 20-pound fluorocarbon leader. Now, this year was the first year that I used that braid to fluorocarbon leader a lot on my flipping and pitching setup, and I absolutely loved doing that. It just made things really easy. Using that smaller rod, that 7-foot 3-inch, where a lot of times I used to use a 7-foot 6-inch rod, it was just so easy. It was so easy to manage when I was out there flipping and pitching around. Now, anytime I was fishing around really heavy cover, I was using that bigger rod, because with that big rod, I feel like you just have a lot more kind of power to pull that fish out of the cover if you have some length. So the rod I was using was an Arc Gunnersville Special. It's a 7-foot 11-inch rod. So it's got plenty of length, plenty of power that you can really lean on that fish to kind of get them out of the cover. So moving on to lure number 3 of 2022 is a classic bait. It's one that seems to just produce bass year in and year out in all different situations, and that was a swim jig. Now for me, I specifically like the Freedom Tackle swim jig. I probably use the 3/8 ounce size the most, and I keep my swim jigs pretty simple. I like green pumpkin, black and blue, or white. Those 3 colors pretty much have me covered no matter where I'm fishing in the country. Now on the back of a swim jig, I usually put some sort of crawl bait like a Strike King Rage Crawl. There are some times where I will put a swim bait, kind of like your typical Kitech bait. Now, if I am fishing that swim jig offshore a little bit deeper, that's typically when I go with that Kitech bait. But for me, I fish a swim jig primarily pretty shallow. I mean, up in really shallow cover, around vegetation, around wood cover. In those situations, I'm gonna use that Rage Crawl. Now, I typically am going to use straight braid in this situation. And the rod that I use a swim jig for was a rod that I just mentioned. It was the Moneymaker rod, that 7-foot 3-inch medium heavy power fast action rod. That rod I use for so many different applications, but it's perfect for a swim jig. And again, I'm gonna use straight braid, usually 50-pound test, and I'm just gonna fish that swim jig around everything that I see up shallow. I really like swim jigs because they will work when the weather is really kind of crappy out, and they also work when the weather is like really still, sunny, and calm. You know, a spinnerbait is a great bait when you have really windy days, or a chatterbait can be really good in, you know, kind of rough conditions. But when those conditions really get calm, if it's glass calm, those are the times where a swim jig will outproduce both a chatterbait or a spinnerbait. And so I use the swim jig a lot. I used it all over the place and caught a ton of big bass on it. All right, the 4th lure is more of a lure category. I could not help but break this down because if you watch this channel, you know that I am a fanatic about topwater fishing. I have always loved topwater fishing, and I do it. I have a topwater tied up pretty much year round. I mean, even in really, really cold water. And so I'm going to put topwaters as a whole for lure number 4. Now, the lures inside that category that I use the most include the Evergreen JT 115. This is a silent walking bait. I actually just recently did a whole video on this particular bait. It has no rattles in it. It's completely silent. And that particular walking bait will outproduce a lot of other baits, especially when you have calm conditions. And so I use that one a lot, caught a lot of big bass on it, actually won a couple of tournaments on that specific bait this year. Now, another bait that I use inside the topwater category a lot was a poppin' frog. A Spro poppin' frog has long been one of my absolute favorite lures to use. And anytime that I am fishing shallow, and I feel like a lot of guys are doing the same thing, maybe that's flipping and pitching the bank. I see this a lot here in Ohio. There's a lot of shallow water fisheries where you see a lot of guys that are flipping soft plastics or pitching jigs against the bank. And in those exact same situations, I will pick up that Spro poppin' frog and be able to catch fish that they are not catching. And even better than that, I'm able to catch some bigger size fish, or maybe just get that one kicker bass that you need throughout the day, especially if you are fishing in a tournament situation. So a Spro poppin' frog is one that I fish a ton. Now, a new lure to kind of me that I haven't fished a whole lot is actually the Berkley Chapo. Now, this is obviously a kind of mimic of the Whopper Plopper, which I've used Whopper Ploppers for a number of years and they work really, really well. The thing that I liked about the Berkley Chapo over the Whopper Plopper is simply the hooks that come on that bait, because I've always been a really big fan of Berkley Fusion hooks. I actually use those hooks, buy them separately, and put them on a lot of my treble hooked baits. And the Berkley Chapo, as well as a lot of the Berkley baits, come with those Fusion hooks on them. And I just land a lot more fish and feel a lot more confident when I'm using the Fusion hooks. I cannot think of the size of Chapo that I use most. It's very comparable to the 110 size Whopper Plopper. I will put it right here so that you guys know, but that was the one that I used the most. Now, the fifth and final lure, and probably my favorite lure that I used this year, probably the one that I caught the most amount of bass on, was the Chatterbait Mini Max. This is basically a small version of a chatterbait. It's got high quality components. It's got a good quality hook that won't bend out. And I caught an absolute ton of fish on a Mini Max this year. And I actually did a full video on this particular lure. I'm gonna leave a link for it right here. So if you guys wanna learn more about a Mini Max chatterbait and basically my rod and reel setup and everything for it, as well as see me catch a lot of bass on it, click that video right here. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.